Well, welcome to episode 410 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. And this time I'm going to talk about this record by the Vince Guaraldi Trio, released in 1962 on Fantasy. This is a 1962 pressing in stereo. It's not the very earliest ones. You can tell those because they have no little hype thing about the hit single. This is the record with which Vince Guaraldi stepped onto the main stage in the jazz world. It's bossa nova inspired, but it's not a bossa nova record as such. It's probably best described as jazz infused with a Brazilian feel, which is probably for the best, as none of the three musicians on here had much experience in genuine Brazilian music. And it's also the record which would catch the attention of the future producers of the Charlie Brown TV specials, thanks to the wonderful combination of melancholy and lightness which Guaraldi achieves here and achieves on so many of his records. Vince Guaraldi was born in July 1928 in San Francisco in North Beach, home of some darn fine Italian food. His mother divorced his father, and he changed his name to Guaraldi when he was adopted by his mother's second husband. His extended family was musical. Both of his maternal uncles had been band leaders in pre-war San Francisco, and young Vince takes up the piano. When he graduates from high school in 1946, he spends a little bit of that fall at San Francisco State College, but he soon found himself in the Army. The United States was governing the lower half of Korea in the years after World War II, and Vince was sent there between 1946 and 1948 as a cook. When he came back home at the end of the 1940s, he immersed himself in San Francisco's booming music scene. The big noises at that time on the scene were Dave Brubeck, Paul Desmond, and Cal Tjader. Brubeck was leading a trio which included Tjader, the bassist Ron Crotty, and, when they weren't arguing, Paul Desmond. But in 1951, Brubeck's in Hawaii with his family, and he's swimming with his kids, and he dives into a wave, and he nearly breaks his neck on a sandbar, and he's laid up for several months, and that brings a sudden end to the Brubeck trio. Cal Tjader, who was an ambitious band leader himself, set up his own trio, but the piano player he had, a guy called John Marabutto, didn't like the idea of being a traveling musician, and so Vince Guaraldi comes in 1951 in his place. And it's with Tjader that Guaraldi makes his first appearance on record on several tracks which you can hear on the 10-inch Fantasy LP, the Cal Tjader Trio. That trio encounters limited success, and in 1953, Tjader decides to take up his music studies again at San Francisco State College. Guaraldi now forms his own group, a trio with the guitarist Eddie Duran and the bassist Dean Riley. And that trio becomes a fixture on the San Francisco music scene, not least because of their repeated engagements at the famous Hungry Eye nightclub, which would become as famous as a stand-up venue as it was as a jazz club. Guaraldi's first appearance as a leader on record occurs in 1956 on Fantasy, the same label that had previously featured Brubeck and Tjader. And on that record, Modern Music from San Francisco, he shares space with tracks by other performers. The first LP of the Vince Guaraldi Trio on their own comes out on Fantasy in 1957. It's called the Vince Guaraldi Trio. And so things are looking up. But Vince was not getting that big of a percentage from Fantasy at the time, and so he supplements his income from the trio by working for Woody Herman's Herd. He also begins working with Tjader again in 1956, and Tjader at the time had two parallel groups. One was a straight-ahead jazz group, and the other was a wonderful Latin group which featured Willie Bobo and Mongo Santamaria. Guaraldi plays in both of those. So with all this work, he's making some bank and he's playing a lot, but his solo career, unfortunately, was tanking. His 1957 trio record, A Flower is a Lovesome Thing, tanked, hard to believe, I know, with a title like that, and he was dropped by Fantasy. And he continues playing with Tjader and on and off with Herman for a few years. In 1959, he decides to have another go at being a leader. He leads all these other groups and he creates the trio which would eventually propel him to greater fame. And it featured Monty Budwig on bass and, originally, Benny Barth on drums. Barth had been with the Master Sounds. At the time the trio was formed, Monty Budwig was still with Shelly Manne, and as far as I can tell, he'd always done a bit of freelancing, and he seems to have shuttled back and forth between Manne and Guaraldi through the early part of the 1960s. He certainly appears on both of their records through this time. On drums, Benny Barth lasts for about a year, from 1960 to 1961. At the time, the band were not recording. They were the house band at the Jazz Workshop, and eventually Barth leaves, I think, to join Teddy Wilson. He's replaced by the drummer Colin Bailey, who has kind of an interesting CV. He's an English guy, but he'd ended up in Australia in the later 1950s, and he'd hooked up with the Australian Jazz Quartet, and in particular with Bryce Rode. I think I'm pronouncing that right. The Australian Jazz Quartet was breaking up at that point, and Bailey joins Rhodes Quartet. He's on a live album of theirs recorded in Sydney in 1960. And that quartet, which had been backing up the Kingston Trio on their tour of Australia, was invited by the Kingston Trio to support them on their tour of America. And so Bailey and his wife go all in. They get green cards, they sell everything, and they head off to America with a plan to stay. Well, how did that work out? It worked out pretty well, because at the end of the tour, May 26, 1961, they play San Francisco, and who's in the audience but Vince Guaraldi and Monty Budwig. Vince comes up and says, "Your playing is fantastic," and a week later, Bailey gets a call. Well, he's at a drum shop, and it's from Guaraldi. How he tracked him down in the drum shop, I don't know, saying, "Would you please join the trio?" Now, in this time, while Vince had not been recording, he had been writing, and he'd been particularly influenced by the soundtrack to a 1959 Brazilian film, Orfeo Negro, or Black Orpheus. I have that record right here, and if you know anything about the history of bossa nova, you'll know that this was, as a record, a bit of a watershed moment for bossa nova, and it was a huge boost for international awareness of the skills of the composer Antonio Carlos Jobim. All the way through 1960 and 61, Vince had been working on jazz adaptations of the soundtrack, as well as some originals, and all of this music was getting rave reviews in jazz clubs in San Francisco from audiences, but also from jazz critics. Clearly it was time to make a record. Vince didn't really want to go back to fantasy, who hadn't treated them that well. So in the fall of 1961, he makes a demo of 4 tracks, shops them around the major labels, amazingly doesn't get any interest. With his tail between his legs, he does go back to fantasy, and they bite. This record was made over 2 sessions, sometime in November 1961 and sometime in February 1962, at the somewhat unusual location of KQED television studios in San Francisco. There is no producer credit for the original sessions on any release of this record. It's possible it was the jazz critic Ralph Gleason who wrote the liner notes for this and who had some production credits already under his belt at the time, but the tone of the liner notes makes me doubt that. The track list is basically the set list that they had in the clubs, and by the end of the second session, everybody involved was remarking on how fluid these sessions were, and you can really hear the fluidity and the tightness of the band. Perhaps because of this, the record was a smash hit, although despite the beauty of the 4 bossa nova interpretations which occur on side 1, it's actually a track on side 2, Cast Your Fate to the Wind, which becomes the big chart climber. It wasn't even released as a single, it was a B-side, but DJs began to flip it over and they took notice, and all later pressings of this record have some kind of reference, either small or sometimes big, to Cast Your Fate to the Wind. And in a case of right place, right time, the alchemy of optimism and melancholy, which Guaraldi achieves on this record, catches the attention of, as I mentioned, the future producers of the Charlie Brown TV specials, who were looking for their own blend of optimism and melancholy. Side 1, as I mentioned, is comprised of 4 Jobim compositions from the Black Orpheus soundtrack, all interpreted by Guaraldi. Samba de Orpheus offers the first of what seems like an endless string of super infectious piano riffs all the way through this record. And while the original version has a touch of melancholy, this is anything but. It is fresh, it's jubilant. Manhã de Carnaval is one of Jobim's most famous melodies, and the trio's treatment of the song is gorgeous. O Nosso Amor is one of the tracks on here where I think you can hear very, very plainly what it was that the Charlie Brown people heard when they heard this record. And the final track is actually titled on here Générique, but it's not Générique. It's actually the legendary Jobim composition A Felicidade. It's an epic melody. It'd be hard to screw this song up, frankly, and they don't. Side 2 starts with Cast Your Fate to the Wind, as mentioned, a Guaraldi original, a song which becomes a big hit thanks to this wonderful hook, I think, at the end of the melody line. Then we have Moon River, that tune from Breakfast at Tiffany's, on which Guaraldi solos in a way which somehow conjures up both optimism and nostalgia. Almaville is the second of the 2 Guaraldi compositions on here. The final track, Since I Fell for You, is a wonderfully executed bluesy ballad, which incidentally had also appeared on the Stanley Turrentine and Three Sounds record Blue Hour not long before. This record is, notwithstanding his magnificent work on the Charlie Brown soundtracks, in my opinion, Vince Guaraldi's outstanding artistic achievement. On side 1, he manages more often than not to convey the complex emotions within Jobim's compositions in ways that fit squarely within the jazz tradition. His originals and standards on side 2 would have formed the basis for a great record even without the epic cross-cultural exercise on side 1. This is an extremely enjoyable LP, and it's also one of those great records that people who are only casual jazz fans or even non-jazz fans are going to enjoy. And for me, it's 5 out of 5 stars.